Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started now. I'm Amanda Dundas, the Director of Marketing and Communications here at Org Vitality, and I'm really thrilled to introduce a topic that is both timely and incredibly important. Today's webinar is called Brotopia, Using Surveys to Measure and Address Risk Across Workplace Culture, and it's actually the second in a series on diversity and inclusion. Our first webinar on this issue was entitled Sexual Harassment at Work, and it explored how surveys can be used to measure your workplace culture. If anyone wants a recording of that webinar, you can go to our website at orgvitality.com or put a note in the post-webinar survey and we'll send it out. Both of these webinars were conceived by Dr. Victoria Hendrickson, a partner and vice president here at Org Vitality, and a familiar name to most of you. Victoria is not only very passionate about issues surrounding diversity and inclusion, but she's engaged in ongoing and thoughtful research aimed at improving workplace culture in this space. Today, Victoria will explore issues of gender bias in the workplace with an emphasis on using surveys to measure, understand, and mitigate these types of bias. We've all seen disturbing Brotopia headlines, but Victoria is here to share some of the more subtle forms of bias that regularly take place, focusing on concrete steps that organizations can take to improve the workplace environment for all employees. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. First, there will be time for questions at the end, so please go ahead and submit any through the chat box, and Victoria will do her best to answer as many as time permits. Next, we are going to send out the slides and the recording after the webinar, and you can always reach out to Victoria or myself for more information. Lastly, there is a survey after the webinar. We really value your feedback and hope you will all take the time to fill it out. With that done, I'm going to turn this over to Victoria.
Excellent. Thanks, Amanda. Appreciate it. And thank you all for attending today. As Amanda said, this is a topic I'm really passionate about personally and professionally. So excited to start this conversation with you all and have you along for the ride and hopefully stay engaged in some long-term discussions on this. So, without more setup, I want to kind of jump in and start by defining what we're talking about today. So the title of today's webinar, Brotopia, has stood out for a lot of people that I've been chatting with, and I want to first reference the book that inspired all of this. The inspiration for today's webinar comes from a recent book called Brotopia, written by Emily Chang, really in-depth journalist that's been covering workplace issues in Silicon Valley for a long time. And so the book is about the working culture within Silicon Valley and the ways in which social systems and historical decisions and patterns have created an environment that women face barriers to success and outright discrimination. And the book is about true events within Silicon Valley, going back quite a while, as well as current events. So the patterns, behaviors, and implications are set within Silicon Valley, but I think the kinds of things she's talking about really permeate every company in every industry in America. So this is really relevant for all of us. We're all dealing with companies that have a wide range of employees. So, if you've got women working for you, this is going to be relevant for you. So I believe that while it's titled, Breaking Up the Boys Club in Silicon Valley, it's critical reading for anyone who wants to understand the modern gender dynamics in the workplace. So we're not in any way affiliated with the author or the book. I do highly recommend it. It gives an in-depth look at past and recent events. I'm going to use some of the examples from the book throughout the webinar today in order to illustrate some of the more conceptual or theoretical concepts. I want to say right now some are pretty shocking and seem very outrageous, and they are. But that's the point. We want to bring these up to understand the baseline of what we're starting with in our organizations today. We want to talk about what's out there, what our employees could be facing currently, and even if they're not facing it currently, what they might have faced in the past, because that's going to impact how they show up to work today, their expectations, and just generally, what our starting point is and where we're beginning from. So, with that, I want to go a little deeper into defining Brotopia. So we will get into mapping the details of a Brotopia system into surveys. But first, I want to give some examples of what this is. As Amanda said earlier, we have a webinar on sexual harassment. This is less about sexual harassment specifically. It's not about one bad actor that does something egregious. This is more about the systems that over time create barriers for women and other minorities that keep them from being successful. And another caveat to make today is, today's conversation is largely based around gender, because that's what we're seeing the most. That's what we see in the book. That's what we have a lot of data on. But certainly these patterns apply to other types of minorities, and that's really going to vary based on your company makeup, your industry history, and things like that. What we're talking about today is systems in which women are, one, outnumbered, and outnumbers in areas of power. So we've all seen staggering statistics about the ratio of men and women in organizations and where they are in organizations. So while at a top line, we might have relatively even ratios. It might be more so at the bottom and in the middle of the organization, but that's really not the case at the top of the organization, at your top of stack, especially in tight industries where your networks and your past working relationships, even funding relationships, tie really clearly into future opportunities. We see, a much, much stronger ratio of men than women. And this becomes even more intense in the startup scene, as described in Brotopia, where investments follow past kinds of networks, and there are few women in private equity to support other women in early startup leadership. So essentially, we see that lack of ratio in the hierarchy reinforced over time, even if not consciously, based on historical events and where money and power flow from. That's reinforced every time these networks are leveraged. Second piece here is, Brotopia is going to be a system in which women are disadvantaged in terms of effectiveness. So when women don't have the same access to networks, they're not going to have the same mentors that help them develop. They're not going to have the same industry contacts to help them reach out, span boundaries, and they're going to lose out in terms of opportunities, feedback, and again, those overall connections to help them in these tight industries. So overall, they're not getting the same consideration. They're not getting the same chances to step up and succeed. So we're not even getting to a point of skills in the pipeline, but we're just getting to a foot in the door. And then the third piece is discriminated against. The first two examples I had were, perhaps not conscious, but based on social systems over time. But certainly within a Brotopia, these systems do in some ways straight up discriminate against women. There are, quotes from the media recently. Recently, a private equity firm said they won't lower their standards to hire women. There's certainly the Ellen Powell case recently that we're all familiar with. Other tech firms have just been so accustomed to a heavily skewed young male workforce that their practices are skewed towards that population and are quite toxic for women or other kinds of people. Some examples from the books list, common practice being to hold meetings and interviews at places like strip clubs, sporting games, things like that, where it's quite a shocking example, but it's the kind of thing that happens when there are few to no women around to notice that this is uncomfortable for other kinds of people. There's a lack of sophisticated leadership to say this isn't okay, and there are few consequences to when things like this happen. So, stepping back from all of this, I joked with some of my colleagues that it would be easy to make today's discussion a book club of sorts. It's a really fascinating report on an important topic. There's a lot to discuss. Even the examples I just shared, there's a lot that comes to mind, and certainly a lot of questions to ask back at those examples. And I think those are important discussions to have, but what we're here to do today is to look at how we can all use our role within measurement and culture change to identify areas of risk in our organizations and drive improvements. And, I think a lot of us here on the phone might look at our organizations and say, of course, if a scandal like that happened, we would drive change. But scandals like that aren't happening here. We don't have these kinds of issues. But I want to push back on that and say no organization is perfect. We're going to talk today about how we can look at the big and little ways that a brotopia can exist and manifest within organizations. The big things around sexual harassment, massive imbalances in gender ratios, outright discrimination, those are really easy to spot, and I think the actions are quite obvious when they need to happen. But we also don't want to ignore the little things because the little things really can snowball. So when I talk about little things, I'm talking about an ongoing but kind of insidious upper hand that some people, largely in the book, white men have if there's access to a secret social network. So this social network that happens after hours at sports games or other kinds of social events where women aren't actively not included, but they're not a part of the sort of assumed network and assumed sharing of power. And that reinforces the stereotype in women in other roles. It also reinforces stereotype in women in supporting roles through gendered tasks, ongoing things like cutting women off in meetings, mansplaining. We'll get into all of these things that are very little individually, but if they happen in an ongoing and repeated way, it cuts down the perceived value of women's contributions. And these are things that happen in every company. And so over time, they're going to send that message that women who are a massive demographic of our workforce, are simply not valued and not going to rise to the top in the same way. So today, I'm going to go through some of the main ways this shows up, how we can measure it through surveys and move forward. Before we dive into some of the ways this shows up, I want to acknowledge that this is not an easy topic or conversation. I think the first step is simply having that conversation, and that first step is often the hardest, and so just kind of dipping the toe in the water towards starting having that conversation is an important thing to be taken. So what we can all do here today is start that conversation in our own organizations. We can highlight the different kinds of risks there are, and we can use our skills and expertise in measurement to track these things and help leadership stay accountable for addressing these issues over time. We're not going to solve for a broader, long-standing societal bias overnight, but we can advocate for the issues we all feel passionately about, and we can continue to feed this conversation and keep it top of mind. So with what we can and can't do and what we want to kind of focus and prioritize on, I want to start with some of the main areas in which the brotopia can show up, and then we'll dive into how we map that into surveys. So I want to start broadly. One of the main characteristics of a brotopia is a differential in access to networks. And this can look different in Silicon Valley versus other kinds of industries. But this is largely something that starts in our broader society and then maps into our organizations and how people move throughout our organizations. There's, of course, a historical pattern of a boys' club, especially at the top, and that creates a hierarchy in which leadership is male-dominated, and being a male-dominated group, that can often create a climate that is at best unfriendly and at worst discriminating towards women. So a couple of examples here. One example in the book is referred to as the PayPal Mafia. And this is in no way to take a hit at PayPal at all as a company. This is really about the use of a network. And if any of you just Google the PayPal Mafia, I'm sure you'll come up with the same description of the network. But basically what it is in early days of PayPal, early investors and leaders did very well. I think that's no secret. When they left and went their different ways, all of these people stayed in the industry, and they continued to fund and lead similar organizations, which is no surprise. But what really sticks out and why there is this term PayPal Mafia is that they continued to fund each other's new ventures and hire from within that small group into key leadership roles. So out of this original group that originally founded PayPal, there became several leading tech organizations at a really key time within the growth of the technology sector. And they're all funded and founded by the same group of people who know each other, think similarly, and are continuing to hire people just like them. And so it's this really tight group that is controlling the flow of money, the flow of resources, and the flow of power within technology. So, stepping back, what happened here? There's a group of people who hired and funded people they trust. And there's, certainly a lot to that. There's no problem with hiring and trusting people but a lot of these people were very outspoken about the benefits of hiring people that thought just like them. They said that's the way to move things fast, and that's certainly true. They did move fast and they were successful, but they stuck with what they know, and that benefited a small group. And we don't know what benefits they would have had if they looked outside that small group for diversity, whether it's of thought, of background, etc. What else could have added to that? So the PayPal mafia is one example, and it's sort of a term that's easy to use and maps into other hiring kinds of biases. But that pattern is really rampant in the industry, and it continues to benefit one group of people and exclude everyone else each time that network is leveraged. So, of course, there are smaller examples of hiring bias in which people hire people like them, support people like them, and that's a natural human tendency, and it continues to play out in our organizations. I've got some stats of ways that can continue to play out. One on the screen here has to do with, sort of gender and how this plays out once you have people in the organization. So past hiring, 50% of male managers say that they're uncomfortable participating in work activities with a woman, such as mentoring, working alone, or socializing together. So, whether you hire sort of equal proportions of men and women, people tend to stay with and be comfortable supporting people like themselves. So, if we don't intervene on these networks, we're not only going to continue to have an imbalance at the top, but of who can get to the top, who has mentors, who has that informal kind of network that they can leverage within organizations to learn, grow, and develop. Women are really at a disadvantage here. So from here, I want to move on, past networks to see how these uneven networks can impact women once they're in organizations. So a couple things here. When we have those different organizations and access to hierarchies based on the structure of a company, that's going to have a trickle-down effect in which people have different access to resources and opportunities. So I referenced some of these examples earlier, but largely men and women are going to have different levels of access to what they need to be successful. For an entrepreneur, that might be funding and support to break into the scene and support a project. For an early to mid-career professional, that might be connections, the availability of mentors, contacts at the senior level to help them develop and address barriers, sponsors to move things forward. We've got another example on the screen here where senior men say they're 5 times more likely to hesitate to travel for work with a junior woman than with a junior level man. So this has nothing to do with skills or the work itself, but because of this gender imbalance, women are likely to lose out on these kinds of opportunities because they are not a part of this network, and because a lot of men, it seems like, don't feel equipped to handle this, or that they're nervous about giving this kind of mentorship or informal sort of social network to women in an equal way that they do to men. So here we can start to see at every level, women are just not having the same kinds of opportunities as a trickle down from who has historically been at the top of the organizations. And this is not always a conscious thing. Whether or not a differential in resources is conscious, the opportunities, funding, and connections are going to naturally follow those networks. So if we don't intervene to consciously balance our networks, those networks are going to follow social patterns, which have traditionally not included everyone equally. And that's going to impact individuals who don't have the support to move their ideas at a granular level, projects, careers, even larger groups moving throughout the organization. And over time, the culture of the organization itself will suffer. So if we step down to the next level, we want to start to look at organizational practices. So if we've got uneven ratios of men and women or any other kind of segment of employees in leadership, the culture is going to become more supportive or skewed by the majority, consciously or not, because that's who's setting the culture. So this can lead to practices that exclude minorities, such as women, if the majority of that group is men. And then over time, if that's the behaviors that are common and supported, these become organizational practices, and they become part of a system that allow a Brotopia to exist. So this is where we start to talk about big and small things that start to occur. And over time, even those small things are going to snowball and make women feel really uncomfortable. So some examples, some from the book and some from our work with diversity and inclusion here. First one I'm going to give is design of leadership retreats. We were working with one organization where we were starting to find some differentials in scores on surveys across men and women in leadership. They were still very high scores, but they were qualitatively different. And so in starting to talk with some of these female leaders, we asked, what is it that feels different? And they said it's a lot of these unconscious things that just over time send the message that it's expected that it's really men in those leadership seats. So the leadership retreats, certainly everyone's invited to all activities, but the spouse activities were things like going to the spa or going shopping or really female geared activities. So the assumption there is that the leader who's in the meeting all day is a man, and that their spouse is a woman, and that this is a traditional heterosexual kind of couple. And so this is not telling a woman outright she's unwelcome in leadership by any means, but it is over time saying, oh, we didn't expect you here. And that's at the very top of a very large organization that's on every best places to work list. So certainly if they've got that popping up, this is a common kind of thing. Some more sort of outrageous examples. In the book, there is a reference to conference room G. In the tech space, there's a term for conference room G, and whether you're holding meetings and interviews in conference room G, and that actually refers to a strip club in the San Francisco Bay Area that many tech organizations have used for such meetings. So that came out in the book, and I think in some of the organizations that were named, that's changed. But I think it's important to note that this book came out in 2018. This is not something from the 70s. This is currently a practice that was held, supported, and discussed openly enough that it ended up in a book just this year. And then on the total other end of the scale, not at all a scandalous issue, but I think one that a lot of people on the phone can identify with is gendered tasks. Very commonly in organizations, women are, regardless of function or level, are expected to take on supporting level tasks or the kinds of tasks that would have been traditionally taken on by some kind of administrative role, like taking notes or setting up social events or taking on things that have nothing to do with the work but are in a kind of caretaking or supportive role. And certainly there's nothing wrong with individual people taking these on now and then, but the overall skew of the balance tends to be that these are women taking these on, and that it's expected that they do. And so again, that's going to send a message over time that that's really the value, is in the support and not the quality of their work and expertise. And so last step here before we start mapping into surveys is the more granular level behaviors that start to happen when a culture is systemically geared towards a majority. So these are often unconscious. They're not meant by any one person to directly keep women down, but over time, as these are reinforced and as they become more common, they can present barriers towards women being successful as a group, and women individually can become to feel unwelcome or not valued as they're subjected to these over time. A couple of examples of the kind of individual behaviors that become normalized. Again, this idea of mentorship networks. I listed some stats earlier about men being uncomfortable mentoring or supporting women. If that becomes ingrained in sort of an individual way where, you know, a woman really can't find the support she needs, you know, that certainly becomes one. Another is flow of ideas and speech patterns. So what we see when we study, you know, speech patterns and meeting flow is that women tend to open with their ideas and begin with context and get cut off before they're able to share the meat of their idea or implications in a way that men are not. So I think part of the message here is, you know, do women have the floor? Do women have the climate to speak up and share and in a safe way, in the same way that men do? And this starts to get into the individual patterns that happen at a team level, not just at the top leadership level, but the top leadership level and sort of who's there and what the values are trickle down in a way that, you know, do we expect men and women to be in the same kinds of roles, contributing in the same ways, regardless of style. So with that, I want to step back from, you know, the kinds of things that define a Brotopia into the role of surveys and what we can do with our expertise. So those are the 4 areas that contribute to a Brotopia. And I think we can all agree that we're not going to make an overnight change to historical patterns that have led to gendered networks and imbalances and the long-standing patterns that have led to an imbalanced pipeline. But what we can do is we can identify issues within our organizations today, and we can track progress. So our role with surveys here is not to identify who might be an individual offender or to fix the system overnight, but to prioritize the most relevant issues for your environment today and support those improvements over time, just as you would with any other action planning activity. It's just that the content is different. So in our next set of slides, we're going to go through those 4 areas again, those 4 areas of a Brotopia, but look really specifically at how we can find those hotspots with a survey. So if we start with access to networks, this is, again, starting with the top and how we're bringing in those patterns from our larger society into our companies, and we want to ensure that it's fair for all and that those networks are set up in a way that's accessible. So even if, you know, you do have a pipeline that skews towards, you know, heavily male people in your top leadership teams, do people still have the right kinds of access to get what they need to be successful? So the kinds of things we might ask or look for across our survey is, you know, do networks include people like me across level, across job types, and across geographies? One thing we found in the research is, you know, people who see someone they can identify with across the organization feel more comfortable. They feel like this is a place they can stay. This is a place they can be successful. Someone else has done it before them. We also want to know if all employees have the same access to mentors who can identify with their context and potential unique barriers they face. So, you know, again, can I look across that organization and see someone who's successful, see someone who's maybe dealt with the same barriers I may face, and give me advice on how I can develop into the kind of role I want and how I can deal with some of these things I might be facing. And do all employees have access to visible success stories they can identify with? You know, one thing we talk about a lot at Org Vitality is storytelling, and the way that can help employees identify with different values of the culture and see cultural values lived day to day. You know, are there success stories of people like me, I think matters quite a bit. The next piece is access to resources. So, one of the more important components of networks and why we're even talking about them today are the resources that flow out of it. So the next level down from who's in the network is to understand whether all employees have access to the kind of support they need to be successful. So this is going to depend a little bit on the level of employee and the kind of organization. But if we're talking about access to move things along, do all employees have the same access to fund and further initiatives? And I want to say here, this isn't does my idea get funded no matter what? Because of course, we're funding the right ideas that further organizational effectiveness. But do I have the same access to potentially get it? Can I show up? Do I have the same foot in the door? Is really the question here. Aside from resources and finances, do I have connections and introductions to further my work, ideas, and relationships? We know that a lot of success in organizations is knowing people across the company in order to get things done, learn other pieces of context across functions in order to have a full picture. And this is one area where that network really matters and plays out. And then at a more granular level, do I have the opportunities to grow within the role? I think this is where that example of men being nervous to travel with women can often come up of before we're even talking about finances and in furthering ideas, or before we're even talking about another opportunity within the company, do I have the same opportunities within the role that someone else would have? And then, taking that a step further, the same opportunity to grow and develop across the organization. And that's going to tie into the second bullet here of, do I have the same connections and introductions across the company that can help me grow within the company over time? And then that's going to take us from the network to some of those organizational practices. So underneath the structure are the commonly held practices that make up a culture. So this will fall naturally out of the values that are set through the structure and start to have a trickle-down effect. So here's where we ask about things around inclusion. So are all of our employees equally included in formal and informal situations? I think the formal is easier to track and define, but as we know, the informal context of networks has just as big of an effect on how people feel included in the company, whether they have access to the network, whether they have access to opportunities. So we want to make sure that we're tracking that and that we're aware of the kinds of informal networks that are cropping up throughout the organization. We will know they're there, so how can we track that they're equally inclusive? And then we also want to see, are employees given choices on how they can balance modern work and life situations without sacrificing career opportunities? Certainly the work's got to get done. There are different ways companies are offering employees choices in how to do this, but we want to make sure that there is appropriate choice and flexibility in a way that doesn't favor any class of employee or gender over the other in ways that sacrifices career opportunities. One of our favorite survey questions here is whether you can continue to grow your career without sacrificing family life or your personal life. So that's one way to look at whether there are practices that tend to support all types of employees. And then finally, as we move into the behavioral aspect, we're going to look at the values, systems, and practices and how they cascade into individual behaviors across the organization. So this includes how employees of all levels and functions treat each other and how they expect to be treated. So some of the examples of behaviors that I shared earlier is, are women cut off? Are they given gendered tasks? Are they expected to be in support roles? So the kinds of things we can ask are, do all employees feel their unique perspectives and skills are seen and valued? We all know they're there, but are they valued for their unique skills and what they bring to the table? Are they able to speak up and have their voice heard? One key survey item that's been coming up this year is, if I speak up, will it be taken seriously? And we've seen huge gender effects on that in different companies. And I think Part of that is men and women come from a different perspective on what they might be speaking out about, but there's also a different expectation of whether they're heard and taken seriously. So that's one area where we look to see if there's any risk. And then the third thing here is whether a range of styles can be effective. The goal here is not for all employees to have the same style of how they communicate, how they pitch ideas, how they move throughout their careers, but can each of those styles be seen and valued for what they bring to the table? Because certainly a diverse range of styles is going to be effective over time, rather than a cookie cutter type of style that we force everyone into. So this will be more about how each individual employee shows up and feels seen, heard, and valued. All right, so far we've taken a look at those 4 areas that can be how a Brotopia shows up, and then different ways that we can look at or define those 4 areas on a survey. So as far as the approach and how we'd handle that, there are a couple ways we could start digging in to address those hotspots. And I want to say the first thing is asking these items directly, if you can. Across the top, you might find some opportunities just in this, in whether there can be a range of styles or whether people feel equally included. And depending on your organization, what industry you're in, you might be susceptible to different kind of risk areas that are based on that industry and historical balance of gender. Whatever your company makeup is, things like that, it could have nothing to do with sort of efforts in the last year or two, but just long-standing patterns will put you at risk for one thing more than another. And it's important to start with that baseline at a company-wide level. That said, often these kinds of questions are pretty positive at a company-wide level, because that's the way averages work on surveys. Is if we're starting with the entire population, most people will feel positive, especially if these companies or if these questions are asked about the company as a whole. They tend to score high, and so where we're really going to find some of the areas to dig in on is where we look at segments of who's really at risk. So if we want to go to that next layer, we want to see how the impact is different on segments of employees. So we want to cut by those at-risk populations. Today, we're talking about gender, so that's an easy one to start to look for. But there are also going to be critical segments, including race, tenure, level, anywhere where you believe there's a minority that might be facing barriers to being successful in the organization. And sometimes that is based on hierarchy or things like tenure. And I want to say sometimes it's even an interaction between those two. So rather than just cutting by level or gender, again, sometimes those are large groups that are dispersed in different ways, and so there's not a clear experience. But when we start to look at interactions between those segments, there are. So if you look at early career women or entry-level engineers, sometimes that becomes a unique group with a specific experience of not knowing where to go or not having a clear network to tap into. So it's key to see how these kinds of at-risk groups compare to majority populations and how big the gap is. So, we want to see what is the company-wide level to start with, what are these at-risk groups, and how differently are they experiencing these really key ideas. So, there's a lot of learnings to get from different groups here. And so far we've been talking about groups on who people are individually. So, are they of a gender or a level, but past looking at groups on who employees are and some of those kinds of segmentations, we also want to look at intact working groups. So manager level or department level groups that work together, that's going to be an employee's main context. So we want to look at some of those manager level groups, and specifically we want to look at groups that have imbalanced ratios, because that's where we might start to see a very different kind of experience. So do people in groups with unbalanced gender ratios experience things differently than those with a more balanced ratio? If I'm a woman in a group of 10 men, am I going to experience inclusion in our informal networks differently than a woman in a group of 9 women and 1 man, quite possibly. So we want to find a way to find those groups and study them a little differently. That can help us understand the experience at a whole, and it can help us narrow in on what's an organizational cultural level issue and what's maybe more of a team issue with specific behaviors that we can address at a more local level. And again, I want to step back and make an observation that while this all sounds like a clear path towards measurement, there are a couple steps on this page that any of us might think about. It's straightforward to do. I want to acknowledge that finding these things and more importantly acting on them is a little easier said than done. And so we want to look at some of the challenges here and in a way kind of prepare for what might be some of those barriers ahead. If this were an easy problem to solve, we would have all done this by now. But there are a number of challenges, and I think it really begins with where to start. And so we all know this is important. We likely share the common goals of making our companies a safe and inclusive place where everyone can be successful and drive performance. I think that's why we're all on the phone together today. There's no argument of whether or not this is important, but getting leadership attention and buy-in that this is a cultural issue can be difficult to prioritize without a burning platform. And I think that's where most of you probably fall today. It's important, it's something you value, but it's tough if your company doesn't have a scandal or headline. There are other critical priorities, and it's tough to say, moving this forward proactively is something we want to do. And ultimately, I think that attention isn't going to come from statistics. There's a lot of survey work we can do and have highlighted on previous pages, but getting that sort of proactive start is going to come from the values of your organization and the values that your leaders themselves stand for. Somebody's got to say this is important, and we're going to take that stance to be proactive. So I think it comes from really aligning those with the goals of breaking down the barriers of a Brotopia. That's going to be your lasting rationale of lining up your leadership goals with what's on here, and that's going to outlast any statistic you come up with. The next challenge is some of the distinction of proactive and reactive efforts, and that's part of getting that buy-in as well. When we're raising this as an organizational issue, there are absolutely going to be questions around legal and compliance. So this is where it's important to draw a distinction between a system of Brotopia that we're talking about today, those big and little things that show up in the culture, and specific instances of sexual harassment. We deal with those entirely differently. So today we're not talking about those individual actions that need to be investigated and disciplined, but we're talking about improving the climate and culture so everyone has an equal chance to succeed. Of course, with that, there will be less instances of sexual harassment and outright discrimination, but this is more of a proactive effort rather than reacting to a specific issue that's come up. Another challenge is going to be acting on those findings over time. So driving improvements is tough with any survey action planning topic, but then you add in the values, the stigma, the social context of gender issues, and this can get pretty messy and pretty tough to maintain over time. So I think it's important to say here that this is not a topic that any one stakeholder group can own entirely. This is not HR's problem entirely. This is not something leadership can do on their own. It's certainly not for individual managers to own themselves at a local level. It's going to be an ongoing partnership of people like you on the phone measuring and tracking the issues, leadership setting the tone and the values, and HR and managers driving supportive behaviors within their group. It's really going to take everybody. So if we want to start with HR, HR's role is not to change ongoing social patterns that come from our larger cultural context, but apply their skills and change management role within the groups they already support. So just as with any action planning activity, monitoring the employee base. So, once you have these survey results and a sense of where those risk areas are, keeping an eye out for other ways you can find out about these things and other ways they crop up. Collect those stories that you hear. Often those stories will give life to the statistics and the gaps that you're going to find in those numbers. And often it's HR that gets those stories. Second piece is raising the right issues. Just as with any survey topic, you're going to have a lot of data. So, HR's role can be to prioritize and find the issues to tackle first, and then set up those conversations. So it's not an easy conversation to sit down with a leader and say, we're really not setting up this large group in our workforce for success, and in ways we're discriminating against them. That's not easy to hear, but HR is skilled at setting up those conversations and keeping them top of mind. So again, few people will argue that this is an important topic, but if you don't have a big headline, it's hard to keep it top of mind. So HR can serve the role of continuing to facilitate these conversations and make sure it stays on the agenda, and make sure there's ongoing data to feed these things and keep improvement efforts moving forward. The role of leadership, similarly, leaders aren't expected to do this alone, and can also, this can feel like an overwhelming role for a leader to have such a values-based topic brought up as a priority for change. The main thing they're expected to do here is to set the tone. So to draw a line in the sand and say what they and the company stand for, what's acceptable, and really to be the voice of those values. Again, different kinds of styles can be effective here, but to have an authentic voice on what the company stands for and what they expect from employees that's something that only your top leadership can do. And with that goes ultimate accountability. So, if that line in the sand is crossed, to continue to stand by those values and kind of show what happens when that line is crossed. So if those are the roles of how we start to move this forward, want to step back on some things you can do today. This is a big topic. It's a lot to think about. It's certainly laden with a lot of values, but we want to think about some quick things that you can walk away from this webinar today and start thinking about. The first is take a look at your survey and identify these topics. As I was going through the slides of how we map these manifestations of a Brotopia into a survey, you might have been looking at those slides saying, those are broad topics we've already got on our survey. Whether people feel included, whether they see people like them being successful. My guess is a lot of you have some form of this on your survey today that you can go pull out and look at in a new light. So while you might know the top line company scores, we might look at some of the cuts a little bit differently in order to start thinking about how different segments of the organization are experiencing them. So, look at this not just by those top level cuts, but by those interactions. Look not just at gender cuts, but look at those interactions of early career females or entry-level functions that are not typically tied into leadership or tied into that sponsorship network. That'll give you a sense of where you can prioritize those action planning efforts and even those first conversations. The third thing to do is look at intact groups with uneven ratios. So you probably already got a way to look at some of these topics by manager group. So, how can you find those groups that have really uneven ratios where people can feel singled out or feel further from that network of power and sponsorship? And then finally, look at other kinds of data for future potential risks. So, your survey data well, take a look at the comments, take a look at your Glassdoor, take a look at Blind, other ways that you're getting data on how people experience your organization and see how that maps into some of your survey findings. This might be where you start to find the kinds of stories that you match up to scores or the anecdotes that you want to start to feed leaders to give them a sense of what it's like there for employees at all levels. Leaders always mean well, but do they have a sense for what people are experiencing in different parts of the organization? So, with that, I'm going to step back from the slides here. We've looked at what a Brotopia is, how you can map it into your survey, and how to look throughout the survey for some of these things in order to drive conversations. So at this point, I'll pause and hand it back to Amanda, see if any of you have some questions.
Thanks so much, Victoria. That was a just really good and thorough look at this topic. And as you said, it's a really important conversation, but it's not an easy one. And I'm encouraged by the fact that we just have so many people taking a big chunk of time out of their day to come to this webinar and to hear what you have to say. And one thing that struck me as you spoke is that by starting to have these conversations and including these issues in the survey, an organization is really sending the message to its employees that this matters and is something that's a concern and will continue to be addressed. So I do see that there are a number of questions that have come in already, and if anybody else wants to add a question, please don't hesitate to put it into the question box right there in the GoToWebinar dashboard. But I'll get started with some that have come in already. Victoria, someone's asking, how do you prioritize this if it doesn't seem to be a problem for your company?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, again, where a lot of people on the phone probably fall today, and it's great that your company doesn't have a starting point of a scandal or that burning platform, but nevertheless, it's still an important proactive conversation to start. And so, I think where I would start with something like this is a conversation with top-level leadership that this is a cultural aspect that they need to stand up to their values that they want and to be successful, with the best workforce, over time. It's got to be an inclusive place for everyone. And so it might be that this is a priority that they keep on the top level leadership docket, that it doesn't go away just because it's not in the headlines. You'll also have some survey action planning priorities around getting the work done or whatever else is coming up on your survey that gets driven down to that local level. But this values-centric piece should at least stay on their agenda and stay on it over time, have the conversation. But it might be that the more short-term, more defined kinds of survey action planning priorities that are driven down to a local level are more about the work.
Okay, and thank you. Here's a question from someone who sounds like this is actually a problem for his company. He asks, how do you support conversations in groups with bad scores or high risk?
Yeah, that's a good one. And that, I think, will come from, one, a good partnership between HR and the manager of that group that needs to start having the conversation. I think it even goes back to preparing managers for these kinds of conversations before the survey goes out. If this is a value that you want to have for your organization, everyone needs to be ready to have these conversations. And so it's preparing managers for people to disclose something sensitive that's happened, preparing managers to kind of know what they're looking for and essentially set a tone where people feel comfortable sharing. And then I think they also need to be careful with what are they going to bring back. Because of course you want to tell your group that, this is a safe place to discuss, et cetera, et cetera. But we also need to be really clear that if there was an instance of sexual harassment, or if there is a really specific event that we can use as an evidence to move forward and make change, we actually have to report that. So I'd want managers to be really clear about their responsibility in those conversations so that they can set it up as a safe place, but employees are not surprised by what flows in and out of those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Where is the line between an unhealthy culture and a legal issue?
Yeah, that's a good question, and can be a tough one to define. When we start to talk about legal issues, I think is when we get into toxic culture and any kind of sexual harassment. So if we're getting to a place where someone feels they're actively discriminated against or face that kind of an issue, we're talking about a legal issue. If we're talking about things are generally just much harder because of how we're set up and who's in different places of the organization. That's a culture and a systems issue that we really need to solve, but isn't in the same bucket of a legal risk or compliance issue.
Okay. And here's a question that might affect a lot of people, but someone's asking that you mentioned during the webinar that tackling this requires buy-in from different stakeholders within your organization. And what do you do if you don't have the support from one or more groups that you need?
Mm-hmm. I think it's really critical to work with leadership and align with the values of your company. I think often mid-level groups or different centralized groups might have a hard time prioritizing this if it's a proactive effort and not a reactive effort, and they don't see the need. But I think starting at the top with this is who we are. We are an inclusive and safe place for everyone to thrive, and we are going to become a better company, if we are a safe place for everyone. And then trickling down that leadership message and expectation. Often you're just not going to win with statistics, especially at that mid-level where someone is going to argue that their effort is more important or something else is more important. And there are certainly other short-term things that can be implemented before you get this kind of system right. But I think the critical thing is to get that leadership message that it's important and it's who we are, and to get that in an authentic way that people are going to need to come along with.
Okay, thank you. Before I turn it over to you for any last thoughts, I see there was one final question. Somebody's asking if you will get a copy of the presentation, and I just want to reiterate that everybody will get a copy of the presentation slides, and there will be a copy of the recording up on our website later today as well. Victoria, any last words to leave everyone with?
I just really appreciate everyone coming today and engaging with the webinar. As I said in the beginning, I think the first step is really just beginning the conversation. This is a tough topic, but I think the commitment to it is to be commended, and I appreciate you all being here for that. I'm also very happy to talk to any of you on the side about what this looks like in your organization or bounce ideas. As Amanda said, this is a topic that's important to me, and I'm happy to remain engaged in. So I'll be following up with each one of you that attended with those slides, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation there.
All right, well, thank you again. Just lastly, as you can see up here, we have some upcoming webinars for 2019. We're finalizing our schedule, but some of the topics we've been talking about, discussing, are up here on the screen. And in the post-webinar survey, we're actually interested just to hear from all of you what you would like to see and what kind of webinars you'd be interested in attending in the new year. So please stick around for a few more minutes just to take that survey and give us your thoughts. And as always, we appreciate it. And lastly, just we are, as everyone here knows, we are always happy to talk to anybody. We are interested in working with you on your projects, especially if they are diversity and inclusion related, or if you have an upcoming employee survey and you just want to chat through some of your challenges, some of your needs. Please don't hesitate to reach out. Any of our consultants would be happy to spend some time with you on the phone, getting to know a little bit about your specific needs and your project and share some ideas. Thank you again for your time today.
Thanks, everybody.